ahead anytime.
Yeah.
You good?
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Vancouver Writers Fest. We're so glad that you could join us here this afternoon. My name is Leslie Hurtig. I'm the artistic director at the festival, and I'd like to acknowledge that the Writers Fest carries out its work, including this event here today, on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we are very grateful to be here. Today, we get to join Elin Kelsey. Elin is a best-selling and award-winning children's book author. Her books include this latest, Hope Matters: Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical to Solving the Environmental Crisis. And she's deeply interested in the reciprocal relationship between humans and nature, and she has a positive message for us all. Before I turn it over to Elin, I would like to just let you all know we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your questions. So please do get those into us, and we'll make sure we get to as many of them at the end of the conversation as possible. I would also like to take a brief moment to thank our government sponsors, who include CMHC Granville Island, the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, and the City of Vancouver. And now, let me introduce Elin Kelsey.
Thanks so much, Leslie. Well, it's thrilling to be here, and I'm so appreciative of all the work of the Writers Festival to get this up and running in the middle of a pandemic. It's very impressive. What I thought I would do today is do a presentation for about half an hour, actually, that just talks about the ideas behind Hope Matters and really what I was thinking about when I wrote it, and then leave time for some questions, which Leslie will be kindly bringing back to me in the last 15 minutes. So feel free to add your questions all the way along in the chat, and then Leslie will be combing through them and will be able to share them with me. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And I would like to say too that I'm very appreciative of the fact that I'm speaking to you today from my backyard, which happens to be in the traditional territory of the Wasanix First Nations. So I'm very appreciative to be in this beautiful space with you. So starting off, Leslie suggested that I would be talking to you about hopeful things, and absolutely I will be. But I wanted to start off with this cover. And one of the things you'll notice in the images that I'm sharing today is that almost all of them are dated within the last couple of weeks. And that's because I think the whole question of hope is very time dependent. When you see a cover like this or a story like this in the Rolling Stone, and you look at this, clash between pandemic and fire and climate crisis, it's an overwhelming feeling. And it makes me wonder, for all of you out there, how does that make you feel? And if you wouldn't mind, just jot down some of the ways when you think about that kind of a state of the planet, how you feel. The reason I ask you to write that down is that I think this is a really important question. And in fact, I've been asking students for many years how they feel when they think about the environment. And very recently, I came upon this work of a person who had done research on crisis reporters. So those are people who cover earthquakes and wars and famines. And what you'll notice there is that the same words are used by students when they talk about how they feel about the environment as crisis reporters. So you can see that the feelings that we hold about the state of the planet are very present and very powerful. In fact, this is something that a student wrote to me just last week. And many of you might feel the same way. Indeed, what I ended up doing was going into the academic literature and looking to see, how do we as academics try and label the kinds of feelings that people are having about the state of the planet, climate change, biodiversity loss, overfishing, all of these pressing, urgent environmental issues. And you'll see there's a whole new lexicon of words evolving to try and give names to the way that we feel. What really fascinates me about all of this is not only how important this is to look at from a mental health and well-being perspective, but also the collateral damage of this doom and gloom in terms of how it influences our capacity to deal with these very real urgent and important issues that we face. And what the academic literature shows us that when we feel really hopeless, it really leads to cynicism and apathy, and that can really cause us to shut down and tune out and feel like it's just too much. And sometimes we mask that by saying things like, well, we just don't care, we just don't give a care. So for all these reasons, I myself am a hope activist. I think that tackling not only the urgent environmental issues that we face, but our feelings of hopelessness about them are both very important aspects of how we tackle the things that we're up against. And that's what led me to write this book, Hope Matters. And in fact, this is a book for adults. I know those of you that are joining in, some of you are adults and some of you are in high school, maybe grade 10 through grade 12, maybe a little younger, a little older. I wanted to make a very approachable book that explores this issue of how our mindset around hopelessness really negatively impacts our capacity to engage and why it's so important to shift to a more hopeful perspective. I think this is really true, that we accepting the urgent and difficult problems that we face is not the same thing as fatalism, about determining because it's such a big problem now, it's always going to be a big problem, or it's already a foregone conclusion. The central thing I'm trying to get across is this, that hope lies in the capacity of stories to transform, that stories change. And the reason I mentioned this time-stamped thing, and I'll really encourage you to look on each of the images that I show you. I'll try and put a timestamp on them. I think I have, is that my point is stories change. And so we need to be looking at current timestamp content. So often when we talk about the environment, we immediately go into this sort of generalized doom and gloom narrative that makes us feel as if nothing has changed and nothing will ever get better. I think we also have to look at emerging trends, and I want to signpost some of those that I cover in the book and that I think are so critical to adopting a more hopeful framing on all of this. The reason mindset matters so much is that how we think about things really impacts whether or not we think there's any chance of things changing, and that really influences how much we engage. So mindsets are super important. So here's just a few of the things that I've been looking at over the last couple of weeks. Very recently, world leaders have been endorsing this pledge for nature. And this is a really big deal because when we think about the capacity of the planet to respond to climate change and biodiversity loss and those sorts of things, there's been a real movement afoot over the last few years to really increase the amount of land that's under protection. So when we see headlines like this, with the EU pledging to protect 30% of land by 2030. The goal is 25% by 2025 of both land and ocean. And we see the largest state in terms of population in the state of California doing the same thing. These are really important signposts that this message of the importance of protecting large parts of the planet is being heard, and action is happening around those. What I think is particularly thrilling in the case of Canada is that much of the protection, both in the water and on land, is being driven by Indigenous-led conservation. And in fact, if you were to look back, I had some wonderful interviews in Hope Matters with First Nations leaders talking about a number of the national parks in Canada in the last decade have been led by First Nations, and how that's changing the way that we think about conservation and really driving the capacity to not only protect, but to restore important areas. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, we see Prince William, for those of you who are keen on the royalty, announcing a new prize aimed at repairing the planet. So not only are we talking about preserving both land and water, but this whole idea of rewilding, which many of you will have heard of before and be quite interested in, this whole ecological restoration is a rapidly growing trend that holds important promise. And one of the things that I think is really kind of a feather in the cap of Canada is this whole idea of creating bridges between, in this case, a literal bridge between habitat. This is one of these wildlife bridges that's in Banff National Park. I hope some of you have actually seen them. There are bridges and underpasses, almost 100 of them, just moving through that part of the park. And in fact, this is a technology that has been developed in Canada and is now being exported all over the world, which holds tremendous promise, because when you create opportunities for animals like grizzly bears and wolves to be able to move from one important part of their territory to another, scientists have been able to show us that it makes a huge difference to the ecological restoration of those species and the habitats that they live in. Another trend that I think is super exciting from my perspective is this real shift in the financial field to recognizing climate change and seeing that, in this case, the Los Angeles Times reporting on the fact that it's been a landmark year for investor action on climate change. And it's actually being driven by shareholders who are demanding, a change in the kinds of investments that have been going on. And so for many, many years, what I would be talking about hope in the environment, I would often be drawing on scientific evidence or looking, often in architecture, urban design, those kinds of places. Now I find myself much more often looking in the financial papers, which to me is a really wonderful thing, to watch the economic movement towards a recognition of climate change. We also see big retailers shifting. And then just last week, IKEA announced this buyback program. So if you have, many of you as students, if you don't now, you will soon probably have an IKEA bookshelf or something that you go away to university or off on your own, living on your own. They have just introduced a buyback program. They're the largest commercial retailer furniture in the world. And what they're trying to do is create a cradle to cradle idea where they are responsible for products, not only from the point of sale, but what happens to them after they've been used. We just heard the throne speech just a few weeks ago, where climate change and climate action was really quite high up. And this announcement, which came out really recently, just last couple of days ago, where we're looking at the emergence of a new UN treaty to deal with this urgent issue of plastic pollution in the oceans. And I did my PhD actually on Biodiversity Convention and Climate Change Convention, looking at how these treaties influence how we engage with these issues. And so when I see the emergence of a new treaty around something as important as plastic pollution, and I know that over 128 countries and jurisdictions are currently putting into place plastic bag bans and single-use plastic prevention issues, it's exciting to see that merging in that direction. So the point that I'm really trying to make is that hope is not complacent. So often when I'm talking about hope, people will say to me, well, aren't you just letting people off the hook? You're telling them things will be fine. No, hope is about situating yourself in the real problems that exist and looking for evidence of what trends are having a positive impact and then amplifying them. And in that way, hope is a very powerful political act. Many of you will have been involved in the climate change marches that occurred in 2019, an astonishing global response to the recognition of how urgent climate change is. And it turns out that hope is a very important part of social mobilization. When we are part of a collective and we see that others care about the same things we do, it's very empowering, and it causes us to bring our anger and frustration into productive ways of moving in the directions of things that we care about. And so it turns out that hope actually helps us to stay through the stress and the problems we have to cope with, and it actually reduces our sense of that shutdown, tune out sort of thing. So hope is really an important thing. And I will tell you that watching what has happened as a result of those climate change things, those climate change marches, is that, look at this, 1,788 jurisdictions as of October 10th have now declared a climate emergency. It means that 820 million citizens on Earth now live in an area that has declared a climate emergency. And when those declarations are declared, it means that actions are much more likely to take place at the level of cities, at the level of countries, at the level of states, in terms of taking action to deal with that climate emergency. So now 1 in 10 people on the planet live in a place that has declared a climate emergency, just since the marches in 2019. And we see this announcement 2 days ago. Vancouver is the first city to endorse a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. We've heard about these in terms of nuclear, but here it is around fossil fuel. My point is, if we don't think to look for change, we fail to see it. The number one way that we hear about the environment is through the media. And almost all of what we hear about the environment in the media, according to the International Society for Environmental Journalists, is bad news. We hear mostly about the problems. And that's important. It's important to know what those problems are, but it's not enough because it doesn't allow us to see where important movement is happening and therefore where we can best put our own actions. So one trend that I think is really relevant to all of us on the line today is this one. This says that the majority of people on this Zoom call and on YouTube channel watching it are in the majority of people on the planet. And why I think that's so significant is that researchers have been following millennials and Generation Zs or Zs for many, many years to look at what are the values of people in those age categories. And two things come up over and over and over again. One is social justice, and the other is climate change. Those are two very key values and important priorities for Gen Z and millennials in many, many countries around the world. And this is a survey that was just done looking at both before the pandemic and after the pandemic. And again, there were so many fatalistic statements that people would after, they would just revert to some sort of selfish thing. Well, it doesn't hold out. It turns out that, in fact, if anything, the pandemic has raised even higher for Gen Zs and millennials how important it is to look at larger societal issues and to push for positive change, putting people ahead of profits and prioritizing environmental sustainability. We also see really interesting surveys like this, where we see that climate change didn't fall away. And this is pretty fantastic because COVID-19 was such a focus of the media that it fell into the category of what journalists call a media eclipse. It eclipsed other issues from the news. And yet, even without being able to see as much news around climate change has maintained its state as a top priority. Another trend I think is really worth following, and one that I delve into in Hope Matters, is that hope is both wild and contagious. It turns out our emotions are contagious face-to-face and online. And the reason I say it's wild is that we often forget that we are one species on a planet that has 8.7 million other species. And those 8.7 million other species have agency. They are constantly acting within the environment and restoring areas and shifting things in complex and wondrous ways. So just one example of this is that many of you will know that humpback whales, populations of them have been making a comeback since the end of whaling. Most populations of humpback whales around the world are coming now close to their historic levels. That's a huge accomplishment. And what I think is specifically exciting about that is Fred Sharp, a humpback whale researcher, says one of the reasons that's true, and one of the reasons they've been doing it faster than a lot of the scientific predictions or modeling thought they would, is that humpback whales are really good social networkers. They're very aware, kind of grasses always greener kind of whales. And when another group of whales is using a hunting technique that's successful, they'll often adopt that and take it on. So they learn quite a lot from each other. And that has enabled them to really return to areas where they once were before. Now that's a big deal for humpbacks, which are magic animals, that's for sure, wonderful animals. We're certainly seeing it here off the coast of British Columbia, really large increased numbers each year. It's also a big deal because these rebounding whale populations are good for ocean ecosystems. More whales means more plankton, it means more water turnover, and it turns out more whales means more fish. So it's really important from a fisheries perspective, from an ecosystem health perspective, and more recently, economists again have gotten into this and have been looking at the capacity of these whales to capture carbon. And it turns out by moving ocean water and creating this plankton surges, which come up near the surface and therefore, are photosynthesizing, that whales are very important activators in climate change and from a positive standpoint. And in fact, the International Monetary Fund has put a dollar figure on the importance of whales. So we see conservation moving in ways that are have economic implications as well. I think that fear and despair, which is the #1 way we've tried to engage people in environmental issues, one of the downsides of fear and despair is not only is it not very effective because it causes us to shut down and give up, but also it limits our creativity. And what we really need in these urgent times is to know what solutions exist and to amplify them. So for those of you interested in solutions, I wanted to give you a few sources that you might want to look at, some that I've touched on in the book. One is this rise of what's called the Solutions Journalism Network. And this is this extraordinary network of news outlets from all over the world, 174 countries. And what they do is they actually support. So those of you who are interested in journalism might want to look at gaining some funding in order to cover some stories from a solutions perspective. But also you can go on the Solutions Journalism Story Tracker and look up COVID-19 and climate change, or you might want to look up whales, or you might want to look up social justice, or you might want to look at school shootings. You could look at any number of terrible and urgent issues facing the world and how places and communities have dealt with them in ways that are promising and that are having positive results. What I think is important to know about solutions journalism is that it's not all good news. What it's really about is rigorous reporting and analysis of solutions in the same way that we rigorously report and analyze problems. Another great source of solutions, excuse me, is Project Drawdown. I know many of you will be aware of this, but this is a big data set project that looks at what are the most effective kinds of interventions that we can take on the planet in terms of dealing with climate change. And you'll notice those of you who have been switching to more plant-friendly diets, switching to plant eating is a real positive for the climate. You can see it's down there at #4. And wind turbines are at #2, a really important thing. And I think when you see a headline like this one, which just came out on October 7th, you know, and we see the shifts that are occurring around wind and other renewable sources of energy, it's pretty powerful, because then you know, not only is that important, it's actually ranked very high in terms of its positive implications for the climate. So as I said, I'm a hope activist. My goal in life actually is to spread hope. That's what I think about and talk about and I'm really committed to. I do that as a writer. As I said, this book, Hope Matters, was a challenging book to write for me because, as I mentioned a number of times here, I really believe that a huge part of hope is dealing with time-sensitive content. And so we're not talking about things that just are sort of a general malaise. We're talking about these specific interventions at this time. So writing a nonfiction book that's timely, which this is, and yet won't go out of date, was a real challenge to me as a writer, to think about how I could talk about emerging trends and give specificity in the book, and yet also cue the reader that I really want you to keep looking at the things that you are interested in and what happens after the worst, so that you're staying within the subject and seeing that it continues to move on in directions you might not have even anticipated. I also write for magazines. I write a lot about the agency that exists within the other than human world. Things like compassion with humpback whales and the science behind the study of compassion. Also, as Leslie mentioned, I'm a children's book writer. I think it's super important to convey this agency that exists within the other than human world and to remind all of us that we are nature, you know, whether you're sitting in a car seat or you're going to Tim's after you've watched this, you know, you are nature. And when you blow a kiss to the world, you're spreading pollen that might help to grow a new plant. You are just part of this magnificent planet. I'm also a hope activist by thinking about how we crowdsource and share hope. As I mentioned, emotions are contagious, not only face-to-face, but online, as was demonstrated by a massive Facebook study back in 2014. And so when I first started trying to find examples of conservation solutions and successes in the ocean, I quickly sorted out that perhaps the best way to do that would be to crowdsource it. And I met with a small group of people back in 2014, and we launched a Twitter tag at that time called #OceanOptimism. And to our utter surprise, it went viral. And now if you go on #OceanOptimism, you'll be able to see examples of conservation successes in the ocean from all over the world. And it's given rise to a number of other tags. The Smithsonian Institution now has an Earth Optimism, massive program that it runs, Conservation Optimism run out of the UK. Anyway, lots of work now in social media where you can look at up-to-date examples of solutions. I also think it's important to develop professional networks. And the reason I'm sharing how I do this is that I know a lot of you are thinking about how do you have a career, a life that is value driven around social justice and around the environmental things that you care so deeply about. And so part of my work as a hope activist is to think about issues like how daunting it is. This issue of climate anxiety and eco-anxiety is a huge issue for students and for educators. And so just this last summer, I've been working with an international group of academics on developing an existential toolkit to help educators talk about and determine the best ways of handling the emotional load of the environmental crisis in their work. I also do direct conservation action. Happy to say back in 2009, I wrote the scientific brief that was used to help convince George Bush to establish the world's largest marine protected area at the time. And I'm even happier to tell you that that marine protected area is now, I believe, the 15th largest. In just 10 years, 11 years, the number of ecosystem-scaled marine protected areas on Earth has really increased. I teach at a university and do research. If you want to, you can come to UVic and I'll teach you, or Western Washington University. I hope you do that. I give lots of curriculum, Pro D days. I'm very interested in curriculum change because I think this focus on doom and gloom is not serving us, and that we want to have courses that are more hope-driven based on evidence. And I'm really interested in policy change. So just earlier this fall, I was lucky enough to be involved in this group who's looking at how we license early childhood care so that more kids can be outside as part of their learning. Outside is really important to me. You can see I'm talking to you from my backyard. I myself do almost all of my writing outside in the winter, in the summer with my ducks. I shower outside. I even sleep outside. And the reason I do this is because for me, being outside is just the best thing. I feel like I'm much more aware of weather and other species and the change of seasons. It's very good for my mental and emotional well-being. Turns out it's very good for my health. There's more and more studies that show how important it is to be outside. And we see more discussion now about how being outside and creating space for people to be outside really is a social justice issue and an important one for our city development. And now groups like MIT are actually doing maps of cities, this is Vancouver, so that you can see who gets more trees, for example. And again, that's because it's a social equity issue, because it turns out that if you live in an area with more trees, there are significant health benefits. There's even significant crime prevention benefits. And perhaps as a surprise, this attention to trees, which many people, probably many of you on the line have been involved in tree planting, is actually having a positive difference, and that there are more trees now than there were when I started talking about hope, a long time ago. So this is my point. And I just wanted to end with this idea that for a long, long time, and still today, the predominant way when we talk about the environment and we try to involve people, we often use fear and shame. And fear and shame can be very powerful techniques for all kinds of things, but they are not shown in the psychological literature to actually help us engage with really tricky problems like climate change. And in fact, what's more powerful are things like compassion, including compassion to ourselves, empathy, relationship building, meaningful purpose, seeing ourselves as part of a collective that's achieving results and feeling prideful about that. And so just on a last note, I think it's important to think about this in terms of how we act on behalf of the planet and on behalf of ourselves. And so people often ask me, how do you take care of yourself? How do you stay hopeful? Well, one way is I'm immersed constantly in solutions-oriented journalism. And another is that I really prioritize my time in nature. And I just wanted to share this picture. I was lucky enough to go on a writer's retreat in Finland 2 years ago. And when I was there, this book had not been born yet. I wasn't sure how I was going to write a nonfiction book. And I went away, and instead of taking all my notes for this nonfiction book, I decided I would let myself just see what happened by spending a lot of time in winter. And what happened was poetry. And again, I think at a writers' festival, it's neat to talk about how our ideas emerge in written form, sometimes in ways we never expected. I've never written poetry before, but in that place, that's what I wanted to write. And so I'm going to end with 2 poems that I wanted to share with you. But there are bats who catch fish and slime molds that sing, and ancient Greenland sharks who don't even reach sexual maturity until they are 150 years old. That is what I want to say to those who believe the earth is already doomed. Just look at the capacity of this gloriously complex planet. And I'll end with this poem. Wolves make rivers, salmon grow forests, seabirds fertilize coral reefs. Every last one of us is made from new stars and old stars. We are always becoming. So I'm going to now stop sharing and come back to Leslie, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That's beautiful and also really inspiring. I was busy adding some Twitter sites to follow while you were talking about some of those, because I can see I will benefit greatly from that. We do have some questions coming in. I also have a question for you that I'd like to start with, if I may.
Of course.
Do you have any words of wisdom for our viewers about participating in democracy as a way of being hopeful?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's an incredible form of collective action. And that I think what's important is to recognize that each of us has our own things that we really care about. And instead of being, I don't think there's a checklist of the top things one should do. I think the more you know yourself and the more you say, this is something that won't go away from me. This is something I really care about. The more you allow yourself to know that, then I think we find our ways into these kinds of democratic processes. We find ourselves influencing. I used to not be able to figure out, how do I correlate this children's book writing that I do with I do lots of keynotes at UN meetings and things. Like, how does that all make sense? And it's only when I realized that I was a hope activist. And to me, that's a big part of the democratic process, is to share a wider view of how we tackle the issues that we face on Earth, that I was able to make sense of that.
Yeah. One of our viewers, Delwyn, I think is sort of approaching this question also, and says, you talk about gaining hope from Indigenous-led environmental conservation and also UN declarations. But how do we then reconcile with both Canada and BC ignoring the UN's request, for instance, Site C Dam project being halted as it violates the pledge that Canada made to uphold the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the thing when I'm talking about trends is seeing the direction that things are moving. And I think we don't have to look very far in the world to see how important social justice is, and the outrage around social injustice, appropriate outrage around social injustice. And so I think that what's important is recognizing there is a tide of energy and commitment around that, and the importance of flagging those issues when they come up and seeing yourself as part of. Hope is not about being happy all the time. It's both anger and hope are very activating emotions. And I think that it's recognizing the trends that are on our favor around these critical issues that we face and seeing ourselves as part of that. And I will say, one of the things I really noticed in the student responses at the legislature in BC around those important issues is this compassionate care for each other. And so people who were there protesting were being, brought food, in order to help them stay active. And those who were not able to physically be there were, others were using social media, you know, to share the messages. And so again, I think it's how we engage and how we use our best selves to do that engagement.
Indeed. It's a fine line between being hopeful and then not doing anything at all. How do we ensure that people don't be stagnant? If they're feeling hope, maybe then they don't act. Is there a balance there that for you has been challenging?
I think the number one thing that I encounter when I talk about hope, well, two things. One is when I talk about hope, people always go out of their way to tell me a terrible story. Because I think there's this belief that I must not know how bad it is, you know, and I will say I truly do. I follow environmental issues all the time. And the other thing is, I think that's driven by this pervasive belief that if we are hopeful about something, we'll be complacent. But in fact, the psychological literature shows us it's the opposite. We're much more likely to be apathetic and to give up when we think it's hopeless. And we're much more likely to be motivated to keep with the thing that's hard when we feel hopeful about it, when we can see evidence that our actions are actually having some traction. And that's why I think looking at trends over time and seeing, you know, plastic bag bans is a classic one. During COVID, there was a bunch of, you probably noticed, people were bringing plastic bags back into the supermarkets. In Canada, put a stay on its single-use plastic bag thing, and so did California. But what's important is both of those have turned back in the direction of that trend. And so I think we need to not get stuck when things waver, and we need to keep going in the direction of the things that matter.
Yeah, for sure. C.M. Smith says, what might you suggest for young writers who feel passionately about some of these topics? How can they help their voices be heard?
Oh, I'm so glad. Well, I would say really think about the fact that solutions journalism is a really rapidly increasing area. And I will tell you that most people who are younger get their news digitally from digitally born sources. And those digitally born sources are more interested in solutions than the old mainstream media. And so when you start writing and you think about the issue from okay, what are people doing that seems to be having a positive impact? And in what way could it tailor to my local place? Or where am I seeing that kind of working here? Even though it's a big issue, what are people doing and how well is it working? Those kind of stories can gain traction.
Thank you. Karen says, I'd love some specific examples of how Ellen keeps hopeful in her everyday life.
Oh, what a kind question. Well, there's something called headline stress disorder that I write about in Hope Matters. In fact, we know that we are exposed to more negative news 24 hours a day on our personal devices than at any other time in history. And so I'm very aware that being inundated by that news is actually counterproductive. It wears us out and it causes us fatigue, and there's real psychological implications of that. So I'm actually pretty vigilant about how much time I spend looking at issues. And I always, when I see something that really troubles me, I instantly start looking at, okay, what's happened after that? You know, what's happened after that worst thing? And I allow myself space for my feelings. And I think that's a big thing for others, is to share our feelings. When I feel hopeless or grieving about something, I share it and I allow myself to feel it. And then I spend, as I said, a whole lot of time outside. And I'm extremely lucky that I'm very surrounded by good people doing good work. And that makes me hopeful.
That's wonderful. I concur with you greatly about being outside. It just lifts everything, one's mood. And kind of tied in with that comment, Haven Sam says, where did you get your ducks?
Oh, well, I got them on the Saanich Peninsula, and I got them just after COVID-19, the pandemic hit and lockdown happened, because my dog was in California because I thought I was going there. So I was really missing having other life forms to share with. And my dear friends, Rick and Enid, because I don't have a car, they drove up and got these ducks. And of course, we named them after them, Richard and Enid. And now it turns out Richard is a female laying eggs and Enid is the male, and it's all great. So, and they're runner ducks. They are egg producing ducks. Yeah.
they spoke up at just the perfect time.
Yeah,
Today, I think it was perfect.
great.
Elin, can you recommend other books for people who want to explore a hopeful future? Are there books that you took inspiration from when you were writing Hope Matters?
Yeah, and in fact, I was lucky enough to be reviewed or interviewed by the Globe and Mail not so long ago. So if you just Google my name and Globe and Mail, you'll be able to see it. And I did recommend a number of books in that, but I really think Braiding Sweetgrass, the wonderful, wonderful book that looks in a sort of more holistic ecosystem worldview, is a brilliant book. Factfulness, that talks about how important it is to really look at evidence-based information, because so often what we think is happening is not actually borne out by the evidence. We're often off in our assumptions, or we're behind. And I think those kinds of books that remind us to stay attuned to the fact, and we have more access to big data now than at any other time in history, and that's a help to us for sure. It's a big part of conservation now, being able, the specificity of it and the access to it. So those are two I might suggest.
Thank you. It's been such a delight to speak with you today, and I feel more hopeful. It's going to change the way I am searching for articles online as well, so I appreciate that very much. And on behalf of all of us here at the Vancouver Writers Festival, I'd like to say thank you for Hope Matters, and thank you for joining us here today, and thank you to all of our viewers for joining us as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And I think the last thing I want to say is that being hopeful is not a small thing. It's difficult sometimes, and it's really important. It's really important because the issues we face are so massive and need our attention. And the other thing I would say is that we have non-renewable life moments, and I really appreciate that people decided to spend them with me today. That's a great gift. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Be well.
Thank you.
Goodbye, ducks.
Bye.